Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you are watching this video. Today we are going to try something a little different. We are going to watch a video of this lecture instead of doing the lecture in class. Hopefully this allows multiple things. It allows you to take notes at your own pace. If you need to pause, feel free to hit the pause button and write what's on the slide or write what you heard me just say, and then continue whenever. If you don't need to pause, that's great if you can keep up with your notes. This is an attempt at a flipped classroom. So what happens is you watch the lecture, you take the notes at home, and when we come in class tomorrow, you can ask any questions that you have and get any help from me that you might need. And that'll allow us to go a little bit deeper into some of these topics and issues and still cover all of our content. Especially with these snow days that we've been having, this might be a little bit easier. So today we're going to talk about the French Revolution. When we left off, we executed Louis and Marie for crimes against the state. Treason was their official crime. Maximilien Robespierre and all of his buddies, the Sans-Culottes and the Jacobin Club, are the ones that are responsible for all of these happenings that are going on in this phase of the revolution. We're going to do several things today. First, we are going to review the part of the French Revolution that we've learned about to this point, and that'll give you an idea of what you can include in your storybook and really get you mastery of this part of the French Revolution. We're going to describe the first 3 stages of the French Revolution. I'm going to give you an outline for 4 stages, and today in this lesson we'll talk about the first 3 because that 4th stage is really a big one, so we're going to have to devote an entire lesson just to that. So that won't happen today. Then we're going to explain the process of the democratization of France, which means the process of giving democratic ideas to France. Okay, we've removed a monarch. Louis XVI's been executed. Marie's been executed. What's going to happen after that? And what really happens to that point that gets us more democratic? While you're listening to this lecture, I want you to take Harvard notes. We've done these before. You take your paper, you split it into a skinny column and a fat column. Really only focus on the big column. I want you to take your notes on the right side while you watch the lecture, and that left side we'll do in class as sort of a check on whether or not you watched this presentation and to get you thinking more about what you're learning and dividing it up into these major time periods. Before we get started into all of the time periods, I do want to review the causes of the French Revolution that we've discussed so far. First, we have these Enlightenment ideas from philosophers like Montesquieu and Rousseau and Locke and Voltaire that were clashing with this whole idea of an absolute monarch. Because remember, an absolute monarch is somebody who controls absolutely. Okay, it's a king or a queen who controls with absolute power. And that really doesn't mesh with Enlightenment ideas of democracy and freedom and liberty. They just are never really in sync. And we talked about that with the American Revolution, and it continues with the French Revolution, again with the Haitian Revolution, and all the Latin American revolutions that we're going to talk about after we get through this set. So don't lose that concept that these revolutions really have Enlightenment ideas at their core. We also have a unique and unfair class system in France. We know these to be the estates, and of these 3 estates, the majority of the normal average people will live within the 3rd estate, and they're really treated unfairly. They don't have as many privileges as the 1st and the 2nd estates, and they have to pay taxes, whereas the 1st and 2nd estates do not. Lastly, and what would probably be considered the most important if you were a French person living at the time period, was the economic depression that the country was going through. King Louis had given support to the Americans in the American Revolution, and they had lost a major war in the 7 Years' War prior to that. So they've really exhausted their resources trying to combat the British and trying to establish themselves as this powerhouse in Europe once again. This has sort of led to many economic problems, and in addition to that, you have the frivolous spending by the king and the queen that has really hampered any sort of relationship or good relationship with or between the king and the regular people. Our four phases are the National Assembly phase, which we've discussed in detail. This starts with the meeting of the Estates General and goes all the way through the March of Versailles by all of these hungry peasant women. And those are the big events of your storybook. The first four actually fall within the National Assembly time period in that short 2 years. However, we don't stop there. We do get the Legislative Assembly from 1791 to 1792. This happens after the new Constitution of 1791 is signed by the king, and it creates a constitutional monarchy, and we'll talk more about what that means here in a second. Then you have the National Convention period. A lot of disputes within the Legislative Assembly cause this National Convention to create a new government. It's a Republican government, and it really is centered around the Reign of Terror. This is where we're going to go today. This is the new stuff that we're going to get into today. And like I said at the beginning, the fourth phase, the Directory phase, is such a large portion. We really have to break that into one day on its own. As a review, the National Assembly period happens from about 1789 to 1791, and it starts really with the meeting of the Estates General. King Louis calls all three estates together at his palace in Versailles to discuss an increase in taxes because he needs more revenue. They've overspent too much and they need to get more money. Well, the Third Estate sees a problem with this because if they increase taxes, it does not affect the First and Second Estate. And even though the First and Second Estate are voting to approve this, the Third Estate feels as if they're being left behind. So they try to not only stop new taxes from being put on them, but they also try to reestablish how this whole legislation works. And they try to get equal voting rights for all three estates. The king is tired of this, and so he locks them out of the meeting. Well, not ready to give up, the Third Estate meets at the closest building they can find, which is an indoor tennis court. So when they meet, they decide that they are going to form a National Assembly. This will be a new revolutionary government in France, and they're not going to dissemble until they create a constitution, which is true, they don't until the Constitution of 1791. Well, the king gets nervous and realizes that this National Assembly could cause problems all throughout France, and so he dispatches his army to Paris in order to protect the Bastille and in order to keep calm within the city. Well, it sort of backfires because the people of Paris are getting nervous, and they think that Louis is sending his army out to attack their own people. So in order to get weapons and in order to overthrow this symbol of monarch power, they storm the Bastille. The Bastille is a giant prison fortress, and they literally rip it apart brick by brick until they get the weapons and arm the people. Even all of this storming of the Bastille and armed citizens talk isn't really causing the king or the queen to give up. Upon rumors of the queen storing extra flour and bread within the Palace of Versailles, a bunch of hungry, angry women from Paris march on the palace in October of 1789 and actually forced the king and queen to march all the way back to Paris and sign this new constitution. Under the National Assembly, several changes were made, and when we get to the Constitution of 1791, this is when they will be official. They abolish guilds and labor unions. Guilds are essentially trade networks or trade unions, where if you would like to become a blacksmith and you're not part of the blacksmith guild, you can't. You sort of get forced out. So it makes it to where you have to be privileged to even work in trades. Another thing that is not democratic, and it's not an enlightened idea. They abolish special privileges within the estate system. They produce a Declaration of the Rights of Man, which is sort of like our Bill of Rights, and we'll go into that later in class. They provide equality before the law, men only. They reform local government, and the biggest change that the Third Estate would see is that they base taxes not on which estate you're part of, but on your ability to pay. So this sort of gives money back to the government, but it doesn't just take it from the Third Estate. So, National Assembly, as they promised, does not dissemble until they get a new constitution. In 1791, after the March on Versailles, the king signs this new constitution and makes a new government. We'll call this the Legislative Assembly. France becomes a limited monarchy or a constitutional monarchy. What this means is that most of the laws and most of the power lies within the Legislative Assembly, so the lawmakers, instead of lying within the king. It also abolishes feudalism. These are very democratic ideas. Remember, our third goal was to track the process of democratization of France. Okay, this becomes very democratic. However, the Legislative Assembly is not all about democracy. Voting is limited to people who can pay taxes, which is based on your ability to work and your ability to own land and other things. So voting limitations are there, which is not truly democratic. And offices, political offices is what we're talking about, are reserved for property owners only. During this time, France is also fighting against other European nations like Austria because of suspicion of King Louis and Marie plotting to get power back. And with this suspicion, we get the trial and execution of both Marie and Louis. By 1792, there's a new government because of arguments within the Legislative Assembly. Once Maximilien Robespierre and all of his group execute Louis and Marie, there's no monarch in power anymore anyway. So instead of having a constitutional monarchy or a limited monarchy, we now have a French Republic. And like we discussed in class and we saw when we were working with our guillotine, Louis and Marie are put to death several months apart in 1793. The Reign of Terror is really where we get new material for this lecture. The Reign of Terror happens between September of 1793 and July of 1794, so a little less than a year. It's taken on by Maximilien Robespierre, our character from the court trial, and after Louis and Marie are executed, he becomes the head of the Committee of Public Safety, which is an organization that is tasked with getting rid of counter-revolutionaries or people who are loyal to the king and the monarch. Within that 9-month time period, 40,000 people die by the guillotine because they're seen to have committed treason. After so long of this happening and so many people dying, people within the National Convention start to fear Robespierre and think that he's going to be after them and try to take over power and take over the role of the monarch. So in 1794, Maximilien Robespierre is executed by the same machine that he used to execute so many, the guillotine. Within the new National Convention, or this new constitution within the French Republic, there are several enlightened ideas, one being Montesquieu's idea of the separation of powers. Government is divided into two branches, the executive and the legislative, and the executive branch, those people that are tasked with enforcing the laws, are actually appointed by the legislature. This legislature is bicameral, which means that there are two houses, an upper and a lower, the lower house proposing the laws and the upper house approving the laws. This is similar to what we have in Congress with our House of Representatives and our Senate. It's not all democratic, though. There are limitations. With the National Convention, the right to vote and the right to hold political office are limited to people who own property. So it becomes power in the hands of the elite again. So even though these efforts are being made and this revolution is being fought, everything isn't as clear-cut as it should be. What I want you to do is end this lesson thinking about how this conflict has moved forward and how it's changed over time. We started off with a monarch in power, and now we have a national convention or a French Republic where we have a split house of the legislator and we have two branches of government. These are very enlightened ideas, but I also want you to think how far we have not come. So with our original causes of the clash between the Enlightenment ideas and the absolute monarchs, our unfair class system, and an economic depression, I want you to think about how these issues have been addressed and how they have not been addressed. And we will discuss this when you come into class tomorrow.